Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our Family Forum series. It's a privilege to see all of you here. Thank you very much for coming. My name is John Whitty. I'm a director of the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion, the sponsor of today's forum. In 1997, Newsweek magazine carried a major story on what they called the lost children of America. These were children that were born in chronic poverty, often in broken homes, and more likely than not to fall out of step, out of school, and then out of society altogether. In 1997, their number was about 15 million little souls. That number would double over the next 2 decades, the story predicted, if church and state did not give children a new priority. Today, we welcome 2 world leaders of church and state to discuss with us the place and the plight of the child in law, religion, and society. It is a great privilege to welcome back to this law school stage President Jimmy Carter, Emory's prize professor, America's great president, the world's Nobel laureate, and joining him, Professor Marty, visiting Woodruff professor, author of 70 books, America's leading interpreter of religion. Professor Marty will interview President Carter on a variety of questions of the child in law, religion, and society, domestic, international, historical, current, institutional, biographical. President Carter might well turn the table and become an interviewer himself. As time allows, we will also take a few questions from the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in welcoming these 2 great men of the world, President Jimmy Carter, Professor Marty.
A great publisher, William Sloane, once said about autobiographies, we read them not saying, tell me about you, but tell me about me, using you as the mirror. I read your autobiography of your childhood, and since we're talking about child, I'm going to start there. But I read it because I was interested in your childhood and also learned about my own from it. And I think we'd do everybody a favor if we start there. One thing everyone in this room has in common is we've all been children. And I even see a couple children here, so we could talk to the children too. Children in peril. As we entered, you said it seemed a very long time ago, and it's a very different world that you grew up in and described in Plains and nearby. What from those years would you impart to others that set you up for having a special regard for children in peril? Your personal experiences, family, school, church, neighborhood, view of the larger world, etc.
Well, I grew up during the Depression years in a rural area called Archery, about 2.5 miles from the metropolis of Plains. And I didn't have any white neighbors. All my neighbors were black. And I had a very protected existence of almost complete freedom. If I did my duties as my father prescribed, which I always tried to do, and they were quite demanding, then in the other times I was completely free to live my own life, to roam the woods and forests, sometimes far from home. I was blessed because then, as is the case now, I was part of the privileged part of society. My family was given special status by the United States government and by the Supreme Court and by the law system of our nation. My black neighbors were cursed, although I didn't realize it when I was a little child, by the so-called separate but equal legal system. It was separate, but God only knows it was not equal. But this was the mores and customs and mandatory laws under which we lived. And I would say that situation hasn't changed all that much. The law system of today still favors heavily the rich, the powerful, the influential, to the exclusion and the curse of minorities who come from poverty-stricken families. My father and mother were outstanding leaders. My mother was a registered nurse in our little community. She was basically the doctor for the people that couldn't afford to go to the hospital or didn't have any transportation. It was all walking then. Some few had wagons and mule. And so I was, in every possible way, blessed with stability and nurture and care and love and privilege in education and in the expansion of my life. So it was a very wonderful childhood.
We have a polarity set up by you now between privileged and imperiled. You said these neighbors didn't have any of the rights you had, but
Right.
As a little boy you didn't know that, and I didn't know those things when I was little. How did the awakening come? What quickened you to be that aware that on a world basis, Africa, other places, you are so known for dealing with children in peril? How did the awakening come? What woke you up? What got you started?
Well, I was really feeling good about my own achievements until I read your biography. I've just finished my 18th book.
Its title and the publisher are?
It's called A Hornet's Nest. It'll be out next month. It's my only novel about the Revolutionary War. Rosen told me to be sure to put that in. I forgot the question.
Your answer so far has been very interesting already. What awakened you from being privileged even on the depression scale with the people who had absence of law?
Well, one of my books was a book of poetry, and in that I wrote a book called The Pasture Gate. And when I was about 14 years old, I and my black playmates, with whom we dealt on a completely equal basis. We fought each other, we wrestled each other, we tried to outfish one another, we tried to pick more cotton than each other. We were totally immersed in each other's lives. We ate in each other's homes. I spent the night in their house. They spent the night sometimes in part of my house. But on this particular day, two of my playmates, as we walked toward a pasture gate, when we got there, they stepped back to let me go first. And I thought there was a tripwire or something they had put so I'd fall on my face. And there wasn't. And I came to realize within the next period of time that somehow or another their parents had impressed on their mind that as we approached adulthood, they were supposed to defer to me. And there was a line drawn between them and me that had not been there previously. And that was the first awakening to the distinction. And it had to happen because no adults in our community dealt with each other on an equal basis. Just the children, but that was the dividing line. I think when I was 12, 14. And I was still not completely aware of how so-called underprivileged they were. I knew that when we went to church, we went separate. When they went to school, they went separate. When we got on the train to go to the movie, they had to sit in a separate part. But after we got off the train in Americus, our county seat, we walked hand in hand to the theater. When we got to the theater, I bought a ticket and sat downstairs in the luxurious seats like these. They went up on the third floor and watched the movie from a high point. But it was only when I became an adult, maybe even in the Naval Academy or the submarine force, that I saw that this was a devastating circumstance in our country that had not been ended in 1865 when the war between the states was over. It was still extant for 100 more years, and to some substantial degree, it still exists.
I'm going to stay with that polarity of privilege and peril. We're studying in the Center for Interdisciplinary Study of Religion, law, religion, and the social world of children. And some of our scholars, 17 Emory professors, concentrate on children that I would call privileged, but I'd call them imperiled. What are some of the perils of privileged children?
Well, I think nowadays there is an environment within which a lot of children live that is somewhat restrictive. You know, I had a constant and self-assured and permanent relationship with my mother and father. If anything went wrong in my life, I knew exactly where to go. First to my mother, and then if it was a very major thing, my father was involved. But there was never any doubt in my mind that I had a life of stability and nurture and protection. And I was given in return for that almost complete freedom, as I mentioned earlier. I think now in many homes there is the opportunity or sometimes the impetus for a child to depart from the family and to cast one's lot with peer groups, and quite often if it's a weak child or someone who has maybe an unpleasant motivation in life, they cast their lot with maybe what you would say the wrong kind of influences. Mm-hmm. And they are seduced away from the nurture of their loving parents into an environment that's much more open and tempting now with alcohol and drugs and sex and violence that didn't exist when I was there. So I think, and quite often I see the privileged children being the ones who do succumb to that temptation. There's not the nurturing of a church and a school classroom and teachers and parents all melded into one environment within which I lived. So I think there's the liberation then without the constraints is a thing that possibly leads to some very privileged children going astray.
So that's one of the perils. Professor Whitty or whoever assigned us this topic of what happens to children in peril probably didn't start by asking what happens to privileged children in peril. If you were to take us on a little tour, pick 4 or 5 kinds of zones or spheres that move you most in which you see children in peril with whom you've had experience from which we can learn. They can be global, they can be domestic, they can be national, local. What's most vivid to you? What would you hope people in the law school and the university would take from this?
Well, other than an 8-year period when the Carter Center dealt with what we call the Atlanta Project, which was here in the southern part of the Atlanta area, and encompassed 500,000 people. These were the poorest people of all. They were the ones that were heavily plagued with single-parent families, and the other criterion that we used to choose them were teenage mothers. And we cast our lot with them, and it lasted for 8 years. It was a very important project. And out of that, we visited the families. We went door to door. We asked them what were their major problems in life. How did they react to the officials with whom they came in contact? We soon found that the very dedicated policemen and welfare workers and health workers and teachers didn't live in those areas. They commuted in and out of those areas. And these people were basically abandoned in massive public health, massive public housing projects and that sort of thing. So we got to know the inner world of Atlanta poor people very thoroughly. But most of our work at the Carter Center is in foreign countries.
Let's go back to Atlanta a little before that.
Fine.
Because
Okay.
you've tossed out several things I'd like to think about. For example, when you use the word we, your team,
Yes.
did they get to talk to children themselves? What happens
Absolutely.
to children? What are some of the messages that they carry back to? Were they aware of the abandonment, that all the police and the teachers were gone when evening came? Or
Well, there is an amazing portion of those children who were born out of wedlock, I would say the percentage would equal about 75%. And the vast majority of them lived without a male model in the family. The only thing they knew were mothers and quite often grandmothers, because the mothers were still sexually active with various men quite often. I'm not trying to castigate them, but this is what we found. And when first we found that very few of these children had been immunized against basic diseases. So we had a massive immunization program. Michael Jackson volunteered to come here and put on a concert, and we gave free tickets to every family that had all their children immunized. It was a big deal. And then, but another time, we visited a total of almost 50,000 homes with volunteers, and we asked them, what is the biggest problem that affects your life? And overwhelmingly, it was firearms. They were so deathly afraid of firearms. This was children who were afraid to go to school and afraid to go out on the street at night. They didn't dream of doing that. And it indicated to us the character of America. Yeah, I was looking at a movie the other night with Rosen and noticed that in Canada, which is just as liberal gun ownership laws as we, last year they had 167 people killed with firearms. In the United States, we had over 11,000 people killed with firearms. There's a balance there. And of course, wealthy people, like all of us in this room probably, who live in affluent neighborhoods, we don't really fear firearms directly. But people who live in the ghetto areas of our American cities, either Chicago, Atlanta, wherever, they have a deathly fear of firearms. And that's what, those things, not being given the normal opportunity just to be immunized against diseases, not knowing about where to go, not knowing how to cash a check without paying $8 to get your welfare check cashed, to pay the rent in your government project. Those were the kind of things that were revelations to us. And I'm supposed to know I had been governor of all these people, and I had been their president as well. Mm-hmm. So that disparity between the affluent part of society that make all the decisions and the other part of our society who are relatively isolated and forgotten and unknown, there's little communication between us folks and them. And they don't know how to cry out in pain. They're basically silent and inarticulate, even if they had the motivation to cry out. And they exist right here, within just a few miles of Emory University.
So you carry all these visions, and now the next one, I interrupted you, taking it to the national level. Peril zones. What you see, what you saw, but also what you see, because you're alert to the year 2003 on this issue. What are the perils?
Well, I don't want to beat a dead horse about it, but still, early in this millennium, 3 years ago, I made 2 major speeches, which I rarely do anymore, except on the Emory campus. I lecture some. But I was asked to address 2 large audiences, one in Asia and the other one in Norway, about the greatest challenge that the world faces in the new millennium. And without any hesitation, I said then, which repeating what I've already said, it's a growing chasm between the rich people in the world and the poor people. And it's not only between the families that I've already described, black and white and so forth, or urban Atlanta and the ghetto area of Atlanta, but it's between nations. I remember that I looked up the statistics then. In 1900, the richest nations in the world were 10 times richer than the poorest nations. By 1960, we were 30 times richer. Nowadays, when I made my speech, 75 times more income. 35 of the nations in which the Carter Center is involved on a daily basis are in Africa, 35 of those countries. And 80% of the people that live in the areas that we serve make less than $1 a day. And it's almost inconceivable for any of us to envision, how would I live on $1 a day? How would I pay for housing and clothing and food, which I have to have, which means that there is no opportunity for health care or education or expansion of one's life or self-respect or hope for the future there's an ingrained and inevitable imposition on those people of despair and hopelessness, and eventually alienation and anger, and sometimes it leads to violence. And with globalization, those people who formerly lived in isolated villages in Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger and so forth now know by various means that my lot is not to be compared with the village next door, but look how poor I am and how deprived I am compared to the rest of the world. So that animosity builds up, and I think that's a main cause of the spread of anger and the fact that we now have more wars in the world than ever before in history. And all of them are civil wars just about. And there are people that rise up against their own government, which may or may not be a benevolent government. Quite often it's not, because they have to lash out at someone just to try to give a better chance for their wife to have some firewood to burn, or their family to have some food to eat. So this is a prevalent and growing problem. It's not getting any better at all.
And many of these fighters are themselves children.
Yes, they're children, as you see in Liberia and earlier in Uganda, and now in southern Sudan, where the Carter Center is active every day. These kids are quite often 8 or 10 years old, and the only thing they have in life is an AK-47, and they know how to use it. Mm-hmm. And then when you finally do bring peace to a country, what are these kids going to do? You know, they don't have any education. The school is not there. There's no relationship between Emory University or Harvard or Yale, say, and the higher education system in Ethiopia, mm-hmm. or Mali or Burkina Faso or Guyana. There is some little bit of relationship between Emory and, say, the Sorbonne, or maybe great universities in England, but we don't reach out to them, and we don't have the motivation to do it. And this is the primary problem with children. I'm not talking about adults. I'm talking about just children, which is the subject of this conference. And the main problem in this country with children is that extreme and unacknowledged division between all of us rich folks and the poor people, about whom we care very little, if at all.
Some years ago at the American Historical Association, somebody read a paper on Protestant Presbyterian, mainly clergy in South Carolina, 1830s to 1860s. They were good people, they were good pastors, they called on the sick, they preached the gospel, they did all those things, and all of them gave total defenses of slavery. And we felt real righteous. And that evening in the hotel room, the way historians gather at conventions, somebody said, well, we're kind of smug. What do you suppose 100 years from now somebody will pull out an envelope and say, what did you not see? What were you just taking for granted? And everyone had some version of the fact that we've learned to live with a permanent underclass, rural and urban.
That's true.
And go about our life as if it's not there. Now, you said something kind of, it's devastating to talk about the devastated. You see children without hope.
Yes.
But I've seen many films, and I know people who walk there with you, and somehow you seem to have a rapport with them. Do you impart hope, or what? How do you sustain yourself in their midst?
We try to, in the midst of their despair, but you can only impart hope not with promises, but with tangible improvements in their lives. There's a devastating disease called guinea worm. We began working on this problem in 21 countries in Asia, 3 in Asia, and the rest of them across the continent of Africa about 15 years ago. We had 3.5 million cases. Now we have about 50,000 cases, which is, you see, is almost a 99% reduction. And we go into a village, and sometimes 2/3 of the people are afflicted with this indescribably horrible disease. And by teaching them what causes the disease and giving them rudimentary things to correct it, just a filter cloth to strain their water, we go back a year later, there is no guinea worm. And there never will be any guinea worm anymore. This is a fiery serpent mentioned in the Bible, by the way. And this gives them hope for the first time. For the first time, they have had a promise fulfilled. And for the first time, they have taken the action themselves, which has corrected a problem that afflicts their own people. So it gives them self-respect and dignity and respect for their leaders. And we do this in multiple cases. We have 4 other diseases and also a major agriculture project. But I think it has to be something very tangible to encompass that. But our country, the United States, is one that has not set a good example. You know, we worship, you and I both worship the Prince of Peace. The people with whom I'm relating and about whom I'm talking look upon the United States as a powerful, arrogant, rich country completely dedicated to violence and to the attack on defenseless countries. And the leaders know that the policies of our American people are inimical to them. For instance, I'll just give you one quick example. I don't want to make my answers too long, but a number of years ago, the largest number of leaders ever assembled in the world at one time came to the United Nations to evolve a treaty on the rights of the child. It was a simple subject, but all of those leaders, particularly from the poor countries, know that everything they face deals with their children. And so I think 87 presidents or prime ministers showed up. Quite often folks send a minister of status, whatever. And they passed a treaty on the rights of the child, basic treaty. The United States still refuses to ratify the treaty. There's only one other country in the world that hasn't ratified the rights of the child treaty, and that's Somalia, that doesn't even have a government. 191 countries have ratified the treaty, except the United States of America. And the reason is that the United States insists upon the execution of children. We still believe in the death penalty for children. And it's not just a bunch of people in the White House or a few people in the Congress. This is an attitude of the American people.
How did the Prince of Peace's people get that way?
It's hard to know. I presume that you're basically a conservative Christian. You know, I teach pretty much in my Sunday school classes on Sunday from the text.
We agree on the Bible.
Well, that's right, agree on the Bible. But there's a difference between conservatism and fundamentalism. And quite often, these two are equated in the minds of people. An individual person or a society can adopt a relationship with God, and we all tend to do that. The next step can be to take the teachings that we learn and to use it to personify or to exemplify the basic example of, say, Christ, or maybe in other religions. I'm not going to get into those. But the other way is to say that since I have a special relationship with God, I am right, and everyone who disagrees with me is wrong. And then the next step, I'll abbreviate, is that not only am I right and they're wrong, but I am superior and they are inferior. And the ultimate step is they are subhuman and their lives are insignificant. And so the fundamentalism means an element of arrogance and suppression and dominance and lack of care or concern or interest in the succoring or the assistance to people who are in need. And this, unfortunately, is the main problem with children around the world. They suffer. American children are bad off. The ones with whom I grew up in archery, they had plenty to eat, and they lived in a house, and they had a garden in the back, and they could go hunting and fishing and so forth, just like I could. But the children with whom we come in contact now in the developing world, I hope developing, undeveloped is a better word, are destitute. And do we care? I would say no.
What is it? We have law students here, we have undergraduates, we have citizens, we have church and unchurched, we have all kinds of people here. As you don't make a lot of speeches, but you get a podium. People follow your actions a great deal. What energies should they put into turning this around?
I would like to see one law school in America take an incisive look at the structure of our legal system. which is grossly biased toward the rich, white, influential person. It would be inconceivable to me for anyone in my family or my social equals to be executed or to stay in prison for a long time. And the laws are very carefully designed so that brilliant lawyers, which are produced by Emory and University of Chicago and others, can, through various means that are built into the structure of the law, protect someone from ultimate punishment or from severe punishment. To give you a more personal experience, I'm not talking about current events, but I had 3 boys, and then 15 years later had Amy, a girl. All 3 of my boys smoked marijuana. I knew it, and they knew it, and their professors knew it, and so forth. That was a common thing to do. And I knew that if one of my boys was caught in a raid on a house, that they would never go to prison. The Superior Court judge, who later was the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, Tom Marshall, went to the Naval Academy. I went to the Naval Academy. I knew that if one of my boys was caught, I could hire the best lawyer, and my boys would probably be put in my care, and I would put them in a strict military school, and I could give the judge the assurance that they would comply with the law. But if any of our neighbors in Plains, my closest neighbors happen to be black now, got caught, they would be in Reidsville State Prison for 10, 12, 15 years. And the penalty for that is extremely severe. And the Congress discriminates. For instance, the punishment for crack cocaine, which is used by poor people, including the poor people in Plains, is, I've forgotten the ratio, 25 or 50 times more severe than the punishment for white cocaine that rich folks use. And these kinds of disparities where all the people that are executed are minorities and poor and or mentally retarded in some way. But there's no law school that I have ever heard of in this country that has the temerity to take a look at what is wrong, basically, I mean fundamentally, in the law system of our nation, where discrimination still exists against the poor and deprived families, which directly and adversely affect the life of children.
What about church, synagogue, and mosque? The fundamentalist sector you're related to is maybe 20% of the people at most, and 80 or 90% of the people tell the poll takers they believe in God, and 70%. We always say 100% of Americans are American, 90% say they believe in God, 80% think they're church members, 70% can be found there, 60 now and then go, you get down to about 20%. So there are a lot of consciences to quicken. So we can't just put it all in one batch. There are a lot of us. How could the churches become allies? You mentioned a good program for a law school, if one would do this. How do you mobilize the religious people to, because they, now many of them supported, I know your River Blindness program, for example,
Yes.
Dr. Faggy and others. I know that the churches here and in Africa did a lot together on that. And I think there's a lot of generosity on that level. But as far as examining the structures of our own political system and our legal system, are they allies or are they the problem?
Well, I think there you have a great disparity among denominations and among churches. Some of the individual churches, my completely objective analysis, are very godly and really practice what they profess to believe. And we work side by side with the Mennonites, for instance. All over the world you see them doing nothing but benevolent things. But there are very few churches, compared to what they should be, I should add, who actually reach out to the poor people in their own neighborhoods. They deal with their own environment. And so what happens is that an individual person or a Christian, as we are nurtured in childhood and as we develop our faith in different heroes, it may be our parents originally and then a school teacher or something like that, we build either a foundation on which to have an expansive life, where we are constantly stretching our heart, stretching our mind, and so forth, or we learn how to build a cocoon around ourselves that protects us from any outside unpleasant knowledge or impetus or obligation. Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing exists with individual churches, to answer your question specifically. There are some churches that I know in Atlanta here, for instance, who I think are modest and outgoing and dedicated almost completely to the service of people who are afflicted or isolated or in need. Others are just kind of social clubs.
I know that somewhere out here there's a 9-year-old. If he were up here and you would try to give him a set of eyes for what you've seen, so he gets a head, or she, I don't know if it's a boy or girl, gets a head start. Grandchildren. But when you're with kids, you read stories to them, you tell them stories. How do you get a larger vision among them? You describe people getting self-enclosed and encrusted, and churches getting self-enclosed and encrusted. How do you keep a kid open?
Well, I think that's hard for any person to do, to influence another. But I've just recently been teaching in the book of Peter, and Peter points out about the importance of teachers, how teachers are exalted and have a special responsibility to have an exemplary life. Mm-hmm. And the point is that every one of us is a teacher. When I asked my Sunday school class, how many of you are teachers? I teach other people, only a few raised their hand. I said, how many of you have taught a child or a grandchild? Everybody raises their hand. Well, we do have that obligation, and I think quite often adults, if they had a 9-year-old here, should try to think in our mind, what is it that I can do with my own life to convince this child to further their expansion of awareness of public service in the future, or the awareness of people who might be in need, or the way to do things that might be helpful to others, or generous to others, or polite to others. One of the quotes that I used when I gave my inaugural address was off a Sunday school, of a school teacher named Miss Julia Coleman. And her advice to me has been probably the most resonating thing in my whole existence. She said, we must accommodate changing times, but cling to unchanging principles. And I think we have to recognize that 9-year-old is facing a kind of world that we never knew when you and I were children. And we have to be flexible enough to accommodate that change in the child's perspective, through computers and internets and television and things that we didn't have. So put ourselves in that position to be flexible enough and not try to impose, our 50 or 60 or 70-year-old example on that other child. Give them freedom, but at the same time try to impart to them the kinds of principles that never change. A commitment to, this might be a little bit more for a 9-year-old, to justice and to peace, and to humility and service and forgiveness and compassion and love. And let them realize that when they do reach out to other people, that it's not a restrictive thing. It's not a sacrifice, but is always a blessing that we bring on ourselves by forming new friendships and getting to know different kinds of people. Because quite often, our little children are brought up in a feeling that I've got to protect myself from others who are different, who speak a different language or have a different color of skin. And so I think that's one thing that we might impart to a 9-year-old is let the child have their own freedom to accommodate the new exigencies of life, but try to impart in them some of the simple things that never change.
I have images of you among children in the poor world. Nations in Africa where there are many, many orphans because of AIDS and so on. And while it's not easy to get to tug on the arm of a president of the United States, they kind of get to you. You're among them. When you share a common language, do you get testimony from them? Are there natural leaders? Are there some of them who say in the midst of this near hopelessness, These are places where neither parent has survived AIDS and children are on their own. Does natural leadership emerge? Can you take testimony from children that would help us?
Well, I have to be honest, it's hard to tell in a 10 or 12-year-old that child's going to become a leader. But obviously some are more evocative, more I would say, outgoing, more eloquent, and seem to be respected by their peers. So I guess that would be the sign of a future leader. And they are, when you get down to a point of teaching a family that only has 2 acres of land in toto, and that's the only source of their income for the year, how to double or triple their production of corn or wheat or rice. The whole family has to be deeply immersed in clearing the land and planting the seed and cultivating this. It's a family operation. So I would say that in that environment, much more so than it is in our advanced society, they are part of a unified group, which is the mother and hopefully a father and the children all working together. So I think that's a way to see them share the challenge of growing more corn or eradicating guinea worm or treating river blindness on the one hand, and the achievement when they're actually successful. Mm-hmm. There's a brightening there. I think that the finest, one of the finest things that ever happened to me in my life was riding down the road in a caravan with the president's wife and so forth in Nigeria, and they turned out school because I came, and there were tens of thousands of kids, little kids along the way, and one of the little girl I remember, about 8 years old, was waving a sign that I'm sure her teacher or parents had made, and said, "Watch out, guinea worm, here comes Jimmy Carter." I think that's the best sign I've ever seen in my life. But it shows that what I'm making is that even the little children know that last year we had guinea worm coming out of my mother's breast or her sexual organs or knees or between my toes, and this year we have no guinea worm.
Hardly fair to tip off the guinea worm in advance, is it? I'm very selfish up here, but if I hold this to myself, I'm sure he'd be glad to exchange some questions if there's something from the floor. Anybody ready to go? Please, 4th row, and
or preferably questions to Dr. Marty.
President Carter, how severely do you believe the U.S.'s position on the Conference of the Rights of the Child weakens stopping child soldiers?
Could you hear that all?
Yes, I could hear it. The question was, how severely do I think the U.S. refusal to ratify the Treaty of the Child adversely affects the recruitment of child soldiers and maybe underage children who work in sweat factories and things of that kind. I think this sends, first of all, let me back up one step. The United States is looked upon as the most successful nation in the world by far. You know, economically, politically, militarily, and maybe even culturally, because our culture sweeps the world. So we're looked upon as a dominant nation, even by people who may resent us. And when they know that the United States, of all nations that have a government, Somalia is the only difference. I looked it up on the computer right before I came over here. They see that as a signal of the United States not caring as much about their children as we should. And I don't think, I wouldn't want to exaggerate it and say that that's why warlords go out and recruit children. But it obviously is an indication that the most powerful and admired nation in the world doesn't have an intense commitment to the basic rights of children.
Some more? Please, back there.
Sir, I worked in Angola last year, and I was in the interior, and I was walking on the street one day. There was a bombed-out house, and a little boy came out of it. His name was Daniel, and I was looking at him. He was dressed in rags, and it struck me that the best thing he might dream of that day might be to get a full meal.
Yes.
And what I expect out of my day or my week was very different because of where I came from. And that strikes me, that's the chasm you might be talking about.
Yes.
And I guess my question to you is, where do we start? is living in those conditions? Where do we start?
Well, I've been intrigued by the subject of this entire forum, how the child relates to religion and law and society. And I don't have any doubt that out of this, Dr. Dinwiddie and others will produce some beautiful volumes and maybe several books. I don't know. Maybe that's the end product of it. But the question is, what is the Emory Law School going to do about it? Or what do individual law school professors or deans or students intend to do about it? And I would guess nothing. I would guess that 5 years from now or 2 years from now, there will be practically zero impact of this forum on the child in Angola to whom you referred, or the child whom I know in many countries in Africa, or the child who lives in southeast or southwest Atlanta. I would guess nothing. And my hope is that out of this forum there can come not only a description of all the things that I may have said, or Dr. Marty may have said, or other interlocutors may have said, but what is Emory Law School going to do about it specifically? And I would hope that there would be some tangible attention given. I would be glad to help, and the Carter Center entire staff would be glad to help in saying these are the things that an individual student or the law school might do. I don't know what you specifically can do. There are wonderful organizations. I don't know if you go to a church or not. The church might try to reach out in benevolent ways to the people. I'll give you one. Do I have time to give one quick example? I'll just give you one example of a guy that was a member of our tiny little church in Plains. We only have about 35 people that come to our service every Sunday morning who are members. We have a lot of visitors come to hear me. But this guy was named Jerome Etheridge, and he was a farmer who worked on a little tiny experiment station next door to Plains. He decided 25 or 30 years ago, 28 years ago, to become a missionary, just because of some inner motivation. He never had spoken a foreign language. He was almost completely inarticulate. He couldn't even teach a Sunday school class with 10 students in it. But he decided to be a missionary, and he trained and learned French in France and then went to Togo. He lived there 23 years, he and his wife, Joanne. And he went to northeast part of Togo, in West Africa, as you know. And he decided he would help people. He couldn't preach. And he saw that they needed fresh water. So he got a group of benevolent people in North Carolina to give him a well drilling outfit. He dug a deep well in every village within 80 miles of where he lived. It took him 10 years to do it. And then when he finished that, he gave the well drilling outfit to a missionary in Ghana, and he got bulldozers and he dug ponds and stocked them with fish. And he did all this, if you'll excuse the expression, in the name of Christ. He couldn't preach, but every time he would dig a well, he would let people know that his motivation. And at the end of that time, 5,000 people had become Christians. 80 churches had been established. And Jerome realized toward the end of his service in Togo that the Mono River, if you look at the map later, you'll see, divided that part of Togo from the rest of the nation during the rainy season. And it was an uncrossable stream. He got some concrete. He never had built anything in his life. He built a 220-foot long bridge to connect that part of Togo with the rest of it. One person with his wife, deeply motivated by his, in this case, Christian faith. And he answered the question, what can I do? Well, one thing you could do is, I don't know you at all, is consider going into the Peace Corps. Maybe for 2.5 years, counting your training time. And just immerse yourself in the life of people in an area that concerns you. I don't know if we have Peace Corps volunteers in Angola now. I hope we do, since the war's been over. But that's the kind of thing that you could do. But each person has to decide within the bounds of your interest and your influence and your degree of dedication, whether it's intense and fervent or just casual, how much am I going to commit myself to sharing what I know and what I have and what I can do with people who are in need.
I see a hand right here. Was there a hand back there? I think he was next, and then you're next. Please.
Inspiring, it's always very inspiring, Mr. President, and refreshing to listen to you. As a former member of the Dutch Parliament and the Council of Europe, I mean, the name Carter is very important and is seen as the most principled politician in the world anyway. You're doing a great work in Africa, I mean, in Africa, especially in West Africa. Waging peace, building hope, and eradicating disease are very important targets at the Carter Center, and you do absolutely the most important job there. But it's not very difficult for you to achieve your goals when we have different countries like France, United States, South Africa, having different interests and making also the region more, they are creating more tensions and more instability. Different interests. I can cite more examples, but we don't have time to.
Yeah, I don't quite understand the specific question.
You were saying that he has a great impact through his endeavors. Were you asking the question of the different cultures, the different nations presenting?
I just want to say the task is very difficult because in that region, West Africa, for example, you have different countries like France, South Africa, and also the United
Yes.
States, where you have they have different interests and different policies, and it makes it difficult to do the work the Carter Center is doing now.
Well, it does. Well, we only go into countries where we are welcomed and where they have a specific need. We know what the needs are just by getting information from the World Health Organization and World Bank and United Nations agencies of different sorts. So we know where a particular disease exists. And we know that all over Africa there's a need for improved food production. We don't deal with cash crops like cotton and so forth, just food. So what I do, having been the president of a most powerful and greatest nation in the world, is I'm able to go into the capital city on my first visit to a country, and in advance I make arrangements to meet with the president. I don't have to worry about meeting with the Minister of Agriculture or Minister of Health and so forth. I meet with the president, and I ask him to have his prime minister with him, and his Minister of Health and Agriculture and Finance and Transportation and Education. The whole cabinet meets with me because I've been president of the United States. And I tell them we've come here to eradicate guinea worm. And most of them don't know what guinea worm is because it only exists in the most remote villages without running water. But I teach them that. And so I'm able to greatly magnify our work at the Carter Center because of my own, stature as a political leader. But then I'm just one person, and there are 149 other people at the Carter Center who do all the work. I take credit for it when they do good work, but I set it up, and then they go. But in every one of those countries that you mentioned and others, we work side by side with sometimes dozens of other organizations, Doctors Without Borders, Catholic Relief Society, CARE, others that you maybe wouldn't know the name of. And we harness them to join with us in treating the disease of river blindness. We'll be given one tablet a year to prevent that blindness. So we reach out and encompass others who are similarly dedicated to help. But there's no reason why any person in this audience can't find a way to help either in this country and in a nearby neighborhood or overseas. And it's not a matter of just saying, what can I do? It's a matter of understanding your own capabilities and motivations and say, I will do something. What is the best thing I can do? But I just am very, I'm not trying to be negative about it, but I would just be gratified and almost amazed if anything tangible comes out of this forum. And I really, I'm not being critical because I've seen it hundreds of times where think tanks and major universities will analyze a problem and write beautiful books on what was said and so forth, and then that's the end of it. But I would, if nothing else, I would like to see this law school say, what can we do about gross discrimination in this country against our poor people, against our black people, against our Hispanic people, against those who are mentally retarded, against those who are inarticulate. If that was done, it would send reverberations, I think, throughout the legal profession. And if you go back not too many years, you'll see that there was no law school in the United States and no distinguished law firm in the United States that said a darn thing against racial discrimination, against segregation, legal segregation. None. And very few ministers of the gospel. It was a matter of justifying, after slavery was over, it's okay for us to discriminate against our black people because you can find verses in the Bible that justify this. And we have, I would say we have almost as bad a case of discrimination now, legally and otherwise, and particularly against poor people in foreign countries, as we had during the long 100 years of legal racial segregation and discrimination. The problem is there, and it's not being addressed.
Thank you.
One of the things
Why don't you stand up and they can hear you then?
One of the things that I'd like to see this institution and our project do is demand that our government ratify the Convention on Children's Rights. But unfortunately, one of the problems has always been that those who are the greatest opponents of that convention often oppose it on religious grounds, as interfering in parent-child relations. So I wonder what you, coming from a conservative religious background, would recommend as persuasive arguments to change those opponents.
Well, it's not...
Want to repeat the question for the people back?
The main thing is what... why don't you repeat the question and I'll try to do it.
All right.
I don't want to leave you out completely.
She'd like that Universal Declaration of Children's Rights ratified, and the main reason we and Somalia, which has no government, the reason we are the only nation that hasn't is mainly because of religious groups lobbying against it because they believe it will violate some things that they think are religiously normed, parent-child relations and so on, which doesn't seem to have been a problem in most other nations that have a lot of religious people in. So we must have a different kind of religious people here. But given that, how do you affect or begin to affect change?
Well, the Carter Center and the little church that we attend is deeply committed against the death penalty altogether. And the key issue in the rights of a child is that one of those rights prescribed is that it says it's, in effect, it's okay to execute adults, but in the rights of a child treaty it says you can't execute children. And so our leaders, and many of our religious leaders as well as political leaders, say we reserve the right to execute children. And so we do still execute children, Texas in particular. So how do you change that? It's hard to know. I think the last poll results I saw showed that about 65% of the American people approve of the death penalty. So I think we're the only civilized or advanced country that still has a death penalty. I believe we're the only ones. But we cherish it. We looked upon that as an integral part of our freedom to execute poor people. 35% of all the people executed are mentally retarded. The vast definition that encompasses all of them is that they can't defend themselves with money or with influence or with their own intelligence. Those are the ones that we execute, and we insist upon it. But how individuals can change, I don't know. What I always say is you can speak out, you can write letters, you can contact your members of Congress, you can organize groups at Emory. Emory Law School might speak out against the death penalty. I don't know if they have that in connection, but that's one way. And particularly death penalty against a child. And whenever you see on the internet or on even news that a child is going to be executed, all this group could inundate the governor of that state or the pardon and parole board of that state, whatever. It said, do not execute this child. Quite often, I have to admit, not particularly reluctantly, but the child committed the crime when they might have been 13 years old. And quite often they wait a few more years and execute the child. When it's old, it takes that long to go through the legal system. But exactly how to do it, I don't know, except just to use your own deep influence. Never is a person executed in this country who's a child or in controversy, or that my wife doesn't write a personal letter, handwritten letter to the governor of the state, urging him or her on her own personal request, please do what you can not to execute this person. You might, I would guess that if asked for a show of hands, the majority in here are in favor of the death penalty, but maybe not the death penalty for children.
Time for one more, please.
This is more of a personal question to you.
Okay.
From hearing you speak, Mr. President, about your experience in Africa or even in America dealing with children, and seeing the horrors in the street and everything, how do you control your anger? Because, if I saw things like that, I would get very upset. And you still seem to be such a positive and hopeful person.
I've thought a lot this afternoon as I watch him bring this realistic vision to us, and yet capable of having a buoyancy and a smile. And her question is, when you see all that, how do you control your anger and channel things in positive energy? And let me tie that into what would be my last. I think we're...
Well, let me add, I always try to give my answers with great care and reticence. I don't speak out, specifically. So when I get questions this afternoon, I've tried to, not to say anything controversial or critical. But it's not easy to constrain anger or aggravation or resentment when we become aware of a specific case of human rights deprivation or the unnecessary suffering of children, or the cheating of someone within the structure of a legal system, and the instigation or cause of despair or hopelessness. It's not possible not to get angry about it. But then you have to decide rationally, what do I do about this? Then you try to channel your anger or your aggravation or your resentment into some way to try to resolve the problem. And so that's I do get angry, by the way, but I try to, with my own many fallibilities, I try to channel my anger into ways to correct a problem, and I hope and pray that out of this forum will come some tangible means actually to alleviate the problem of the children of the world, this country and overseas, and not just advice or analysis that would fall on insensitive or inattentive or uninterested ears or eyes.
She used the word, and we are coming near closing time, personal. I think it'd be very moving for you to elaborate a little more on the kind of thing you just did. When we get into our 8th decade, we're starting to be free to look back and look ahead. We need you 20 more years. And 20 years from now, we open an envelope that says, this is a testament, not last will. Testament of President Carter to people who open this, how you hope some things will have changed and be different as a result of the energies you put into children and so on, and pass on advice. I think this was a good exchange right here. A testament. What should we open up and see you'd like to be remembered for, and so on, and how you get there?
You see, I can still smile. Well, it's hard to know how to encapsulate it in a brief period of time. One example that I have used fairly often on the Emory campus, I lecture in all of the departments in Emory, is how every one of you and I can be successful in life. And the question then comes, what is the definition of success? We are, so far as we know, we're given one life on earth, which is a precious gift. What do we do with it? How do we utilize it? How do we achieve a degree of transcendence in some aspects of life? And this has been a question for 2,000 or more years. And it was a question raised by the Corinthians. And as to St. Paul, and I quote this every now and then, they asked him, in effect, I told you my teacher said, cling to unchanging principles. The question is, what are the principles that don't change? They're the ones that measure success in life. If I ask you to write down what you hope to do to be successful in life, you'd probably write down to be a famous and rich lawyer, to go to a major law firm, or to have a nice home in which to live, a nice neighborhood, to have your children and grandchildren get a good education. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. But they have zero significance in the eyes of God. What is it important? How much money you own when you die? Or what degrees you hold? Or what kind of house you lived in? Absolutely nothing. But that's how we address into our lives. So this was a question that the Corinthians asked Paul. And Paul gave a very strange answer. He said, the things you cannot see measure success. So what are the things you cannot see? You can't see justice. You can't see peace, or humility, or service, or generosity, or kindness, or forgiveness, or compassion, or love. That measures the achievements in life that really count. And if we can remember that, and order or kind of slightly reorder our priorities, then we can use our secular achievements, accumulating wealth and influence and so forth, for the things in life that really matter. But that's the divide that I mentioned earlier between building a foundation on life or building a cocoon around ourselves. We can either take all those material achievements and nurture them for our own selfish benefit, or those that we love direct in our family, or we can figure out ways to spread them out and encompass the children of the world. That's not an easy goal.
You've never asked us for easy things, but you've been very generous with your time this afternoon. I'd like to turn it out to Professor Whitty, who can thank you.
Okay.
We have heard a noble and Nobel savant.
Let's just stay there.
Mr. President, as always, it's been a rare privilege to hear you and to hear your wisdom and to hear your noble and your Nobel words. This is the second of a four-part series. President Carter was asked in 1987 who were his heroes, and he mentioned three people: his mother, Bill Foege, and Millard Fuller. Bill Foege and Millard Fuller will be here in the third and fourth installments of this Family Forum series. On October 27, I commend to you a return to this fine auditorium to hear Bill Foege in the Curry Lecture in Law and Religion, and February 17, Millard Fuller will be here, both in conversation with Professor Marty. He's not president yet. I want to thank April Bogle, Eliza Ellison, Anita Mann, Amy Wheeler, and Janice Wiggins for their wonderful work in putting together this program, and I think we owe a robust round of applause to our two great savants on this stage.